All right, welcome into another special edition of we'll call it the Prospects Live amateur scouting show in this regard. I've got Frankie Thon Jr. With me, the International Director of Scouting or the Director of International Scouting for the Seattle Mariners. Frankie, thank you so much for making a little bit of time and joining the show today.
Thanks for having me on the show, Joe.
All right, man. Well, so you've been with Seattle now since 2018, I believe. You were with the Angels for a couple of years before that. The Diamondbacks on the state side for about 8 years, I think. I guess my first question would be, since you've been in international scouting now for half a decade, what sort of challenges does international scouting provide and evaluating provide that you weren't running into stateside?
I think at the core of it, you're trying to do something that, if it doesn't mirror it, at least resembles what you were doing on the amateur side. And if you're trying to do that, I think at the end of the day, the the biggest challenge is the fact that you're trying to combine just the traditional scouting aspect of it on the grounds, like the boots from our scouts, combine that with some sort of layer of data and metrics as much as you can get on the international side, and
Hmm.
kind of combine all of those factors with some sort of input from different departments and organization, and trying to do that across different countries at such a younger age. And the fact that you're trying to do that so you can have a more informed kind of decision, trying to implement that as this is going on in a really fast market with younger players of kind of like a higher probability of risk. It all becomes a little bit more difficult, but I think that is a challenge, and we've kind of taken it as something of a pride type of thing. And we are trying to measure, or we're trying to do things in a way that kind of resemble what we do on the amateur side.
Okay. Now you mentioned data, and that's such a hit word right now in amateur baseball and evaluation. It's really taken a life of its own in terms of college scouting and even on the high school side of things. Do you find yourself, or do you find scouts overseas or in Latin America utilizing things like Rapsodo, utilizing things like blast motion and getting those sorts of readings from 14, 15, 16 year olds, or are they just so young that it's almost a futile exercise at that point?
As one of our scouts calls it, I think the data is going to be a little bit more noisy, right? Noisier, in the fact that
Hmm.
you don't have the kind of the track record or the amount of data or just the sheer size of it. But we do use it. I mean, I think if you can create some sort of scale where you're comparing players across the board, different countries, I think it's crucial. And we kind of separate as we talk about when we do meetings. There is the scout version of you, and there's the info management version of you. And when you're trying to make a decision in terms of who you want to not evaluate, but when you're trying to acquire the player amongst the pool of players that you're kind of open to acquiring, I think at that point you don't set aside the scout version of you, but you are much more of an info manager. And when you get to that point of the process, for sure, having the data, even if it's a little noisier, even if you don't have the 15, 20 years of it, even if you don't have quite the same kind of stats, or even if it's like trackman data off of one or two events as opposed to a year and a half and 2 years, I do think that, at least us, in our opinion, we think that that's a separator, and we think that gives us an advantage over other teams that don't do so.
So, in terms of boots on the ground area scouts that are covering their region, I'm assuming that a lot of the fields where you're doing your evaluations aren't fitted with the type of technology that you necessarily use. Are those scouts required to? I mean, most scouts stateside are equipped with a stalker, and then they can pull a lot of that data elsewhere. Do you find that the scouts that are based regionally are having to lug more equipment, their own TrackMan systems, or anything like that to try and get that extra data?
We have been given the freedom to get a little bit more advanced in terms of technology, and kind of boots on the ground guys who also carry some sort of technology with them. We won't go into too many details as to
Yeah.
which ones we're using because we think that it gives us an advantage. But for sure, they're doing more so than just simply carrying around a radar gun. And again, just trying to mimic. To your point, now the amateur side has gotten to the extent where now the area scouts don't even have to worry about that, because you go, especially at the college level, you go and they're outfitted with pretty much everything, right? And then it gets sent into the clubs, and so that process has now been much more streamlined. So we don't have that level of streamline, but for sure we're trying to find ways in which we can implement it much more than just relying on a ballpark having trackman. So we have, thankfully, the Mariners have allowed us to kind of dip into some of our budget in terms of being able to acquire technology so we can create some separation amongst players.
That's excellent. How about things? that maybe you can't measure when you're evaluating a 14 or 15 or 16-year-old. Things like maturity are a much bigger talking point. A lot of these kids haven't grown into who they're going to be as adults. What sort of challenges does that provide, just in terms of uh, evaluating a personality?
That's where I would say the skills part of it isn't really as to, I don't think there's that big of a difference. There is physically, right? But the skills part of it and the tools part of it, as surprising as it may sound, like the especially at the higher end, the elite players on the international side, there isn't that much of a difference or a separation between
Hmm.
their skill set and their tools and like the typical like high end high school player that you see that goes high in the draft. Where it gets really risky and really scary is the fact that you're dealing with players that their bodies are still changing, they're developing, and you're not getting the back end of it. You're trying to there is some sort of a guessing game mixed in with like educated guessing because you have a track record of like the body comps of it. But the riskiest part of this demographic is both the body and, to your point, like the maturity version of the personality part of it. If you think most people, when you ask them, hey, does your personality change? Are you who you are? And most people in my experience say, "Oh, I am who I am." I go, "Well, think about yourself at 14, think about yourself at 16, think about yourself at 18, and think about yourself at 21." And by the way, we haven't even thrown in the factor of getting any sort of significant money thrown at you at some point in that lifetime, right? And so we're dealing with players where, for sure, I mean, just like any other team, we're doing our best to get to know these players, not just once or twice, but throughout a whole process. Sometimes spans a couple of years. But at the end of it, you're dealing with players who they're going to come on campus a lot of times um, a harder background in terms of economics, and
Hmm.
now they have money, and now they're at a complex, and now they're surrounded by different players that they haven't been surrounded by, and so the X factor of the type of people that they are now versus when they go on campus versus what they're going to be 2 or 3 years down the road. That is the biggest X factor and the biggest question mark, and it is kind of like the riskiest factor of them all, and probably the toughest part of what we do.
For sure. Let's shift gears a little bit to Seattle. Over the last decade, this organization has had several high profile international players. Of late, they've signed a handful of very high profile international prospects that have moved their way up the rankings. What sorts of benefits has that shown on the recruiting trail, on the scouting side of things? Has it made Seattle a bit more of a destination location in terms of, these teenagers that are growing up watching ball?
I'm not so sure that it works on the player side of things. I think on the player side of things, they still, for the most part, when you're talking about the younger Latin American players and even the international players in Asia, I think for the most part, the they're still thinking about what the big league clubs are doing, who's winning championships, who's in the playoffs, that kind of thing. Where it does provide a big advantage is when it comes to our relationships with agents, and when
Hmm.
they see that, hey, certain organizations, they're signing high end players, they're being ranked high, they're not afraid to move their players, that they're showing the aptitude required. And that part of it, and a huge part of what we do is it's not so much the money, it's the relationship part of it. Probably more so than on the amateur side, and in those cases, in terms of dealing with agents, when there is this idea or this notion that you have gained the popularity of being one of the higher end kind of minor league systems, and that you are a club that's willing to spend money on the international side, and not just in terms of player acquisition, but the complex and everything that we do besides the actual player signing bonus, then for sure that opens doors with the most important people in terms of the negotiation process.
Okay. So, so you entered the fold in 2018. As most people might not know, it takes a couple of years for you to put your fingerprint on an organization in terms of international scouting. Um, so this year, you land three big fish, three seven-figure free agents. Starlin Aguilar comes in last year. Do you think that you have a unique philosophical approach to international scouting? Like, how are you looking to construct this organization in terms of like the international uh, fingerprint in the league, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think if you look across the board, there's really only a handful of, if you will, quote unquote, philosophies. I think if you poll most teams, you're probably going to get similar versions of like three or four different philosophies, and in a vacuum, for sure, we have, just like any other club, like we have what we prioritize, but we don't scout in a vacuum, especially because it is kind of an auction kind of market. And
Hmm.
so the idea that some teams might see several players that fit that profile a couple of months before you do, or vice versa, or you might swing and miss. You might make an attempt at acquiring a talent that kind of fits your profile, if you will, but then you don't acquire it because some other team was willing to pay more money, or because they have more money than you. And so then you have to move on to what would probably be called a plan B or C, right? And so it varies year to year. You go in similar to the draft, like you have a plan, and then all of a sudden the plan is only as good as like pick one. All of a sudden it gets blown up, and you have to. But what's really important, more so than like the philosophy of it, because again, I think most teams are going to have some version of three or four different philosophy. I think how you evaluate the players, and then uh, the way that you prioritize how you acquire those players in terms of how much money you're willing to spend on a certain amount of, or a certain type of player. That's where it differs. And
Hmm.
from year to year, I think to your point about hitting the ground running, or how long it takes to hit the ground running, the combination of where Seattle has been in terms of like their rankings in the minor leagues, what some of those international signings have done as they climb up the minor leagues that were done before we came on board. The combination of all those things, and then just kind of earning the front office's trust as well, of being able to kind of trusting our process, and in hand. Then now we have a little bit more freedom to be more creative and more aggressive, because they feel good about the information that we're providing, not just on one player, but across the board, on the entire class. And it's not just scouting evaluations, it's the quote unquote supplementary information that for us is not supplementary, it's not secondary, it's really important. So you
Hmm.
combine all those things, and that's when you start seeing probably the higher monetary commitments, if you will.
Okay. Speaking of just scouting and the evaluatory process across international baseball, it seems more and more that the hit rate on these guys that are at the tops of these boards, it seems to be getting closer and closer to flush every year. I mean, the top five guys in most classes seem to be producing, at least at the lower levels, more and more as they move their way up the ladder. Do you think international scouting in general has come a long ways very, very quickly? Or what do you attribute? I mean, is it the publications that have access to more information and so they're able to do a better job? How do you put international scouting under an umbrella that makes it make so much more sense of late?
Yeah, I think it circles back, right? We're circling back to one of your original questions about just the process and integrating technology and more information. I think it's a combination of all the things that you just said. It's a
Mhm.
combination of teams being willing to spend more money on technology, being willing to spend more time on scouting players, the players having more access to competing against each other, as opposed to just doing the workout kind of scenario and that's it. For sure, the publications have now more communication with everybody involved. Us on the scouting side, as we're trying to resemble the amateur side, and we're learning, right? I think a lot of the people that are running the international departments were either on the amateur side at one point, or have sat down through, like, whether it's meetings and draft rooms, and you pick things up and you realize that, again, that whole idea that the international market is this wild west. I understand where that comes from, because for sure
Mhm.
it's a different market, it's a different system. So, and it's going to have its pros and cons. But at the end of the day, I think to your point, to your question about the success rate, it's just a matter of more information, more time spent on the players crossing over and playing each other. So as you see better competition, as you spend more time with the players, as you use other avenues of information, and now you're not just going off the naked eye, you're implementing a lot of other things. Again, every team is going to prioritize certain things, but the combination of it across the board leads to probably just better decision making.
Makes sense. Well, this is a fun question that just a couple more questions here. A question I like to kind of wrap things up with. You've been doing the international thing for 6 years now, and I know we're in a lockout, so you can't mention anybody specifically, but maybe someone that hasn't been added to a 40-man roster. Is there a guy that you've seen on the international scene that is just, he looks so much different than everyone else, just really stood out
Do you mean within our own organization, or just across baseball? Or
across baseball? Yeah, I mean, across baseball.
I think we were talking about this on one of our meetings recently. Yeah, not just one specific player, but I think we've done, and I guess it ties to the previous question. what has been going on like with international, like the higher paid international catchers, right? The On the amateur side, there's this thing, and it's a very real notion of like the high risk high school catchers, right? And the low hit rate on them. And just
Hmm.
recently, how good of a job, and again, it has a lot to do with just the information, but we know that catching is probably the toughest position to scout across the board, regardless of level. And the fact that like recent history tells us that like the international market has been doing a really good job with those higher paid catchers. It's just a reflection of where just where the market is going in general, right? Like the Cartayas of the world, who's not like the huge tooled out guy. Like Jorge Alfaro makes sense out of Colombia.
Hmm.
A few years ago, Texas, he had huge arm strength and huge raw power. And now you got Cartaya, who's more of like a nuanced type of player, who's more skilled and sure has his tools and as he's progressed. But the fact that we're able to do that, just as a market in general, regardless of what club is doing that, to your point, like the higher the hit rate on these guys who are getting a higher kind of bonus and monetary commitment, it's a better reflection of what we're doing across the board. Probably not every single team, but I think we're leaning that way, and especially depending on what happens here in the next few months and whether that landscape is going to change. And we're heading in that direction. It's a very positive direction.
Well, I will leave you with this last question, and it might be a long one, but that's okay. Lazaro Montes, Martin Gonzalez, Michael Arroyo. Tell me a little bit about them, man. Tell me when the Seattle Mariners first identified these guys and when you personally were able to get your eyes on them.
Yes, I think they've been well documented online by multiple publications, including yours. And again, speaks to one of the questions or one of the topics that we were just talking about, how usually in past years, right, you're having this interview and you're kind of presenting the player for the first time. And I think they've been spoken about very well online. Lazaro Montes out of Cuba, larger than life in more than one way. He's 6'5", 205 pounds at 17 years old. So just kind of larger than life in terms of just his body and his frame. Big personality as well. For him, as has been said online, like we think or we expect, assuming that his career path goes the way that we think it will, it's an impactful left-handed hitting power bat, chance to hit in the middle of the lineup. What separates him from most of the guys with similar profiles, though, he does three things that for us made him different, because it's probably not a profile that we would probably pay a lot of money for in many years in a row, right? But he does three things that kind of separate him. It's the fact that one, he's not a free swinger. So a lot of these power guys at that age, like they're just pull happy, they're free swingers. And Lester Montes has shown across different stages that he can control the zone, he can manage the zone. He's not going to be at least we don't think he will be a profile of like a low batting average with a power bat. Like we think he's going to have a balanced kind of offensive approach. The second thing for him is his power, and it's top of the scale raw power. It's big. I mean, we're talking like big, like man strength. It's not just to his pull side, and it plays in the game too. So he's impacting the ball all over the field. He's hitting balls out and deep into the gaps the other way, hitting it up the middle. And so a lot of videos that you see, right? It's like a lot of times when you're showing the highlights of like the big power bats, like all those highlights are them pulling the ball. And you see with Lazaro, he's hitting balls to center field, he's hitting balls to left field. So
Hmm.
that separates him. And the third one, which is probably the most important for us, is amongst that pool of like the power bats that will likely end up in a corner, he is well above average athletically. And while he may not be a runner now or in the future, the way that we measure athleticism, which is different for most teams, we think he's well above average athlete, well above average agility, and like surprisingly athletic and explosive. So when you throw that in there and you're not dealing with a guy who's already out of the gate, yes, he's got power, but he's a below average athlete. So now there's a lot more pressure on the bat because there's no defensive versatility. With Lazaro Montes, surprisingly so, even more as we've kept seeing him closer to his signing. I mean, it's instead of getting older and bigger and less agile, he's actually going the other way. The speed has remained the same, but it's been very positive for us to see that in him. So those three things kind of separate him from that typical profile. And at the end of the day, like the last thing about Lazaro, as I mentioned, he's got a chance to be like a fan favorite. If
Hmm.
his career path goes the way we expect it to be, the combination of like his sheer size, the big home runs, and like his big personality, how affable he is, how the personality, how sociable he is, personable, like he's got a chance to be like a fan favorite. So, yeah, just really excited about like the potential impact of him on the field and off the field, really.
Really quickly, before you go into the other two, it just struck me while we were talking about him. You know, uh, the guy in Houston. I'm trying to remember his name. Jordan Alvarez.
Yeah.
You know, those comparisons get thrown around a whole lot, but uh, when Carlos Peguero was in Seattle, he was terribly underrated athlete,
Hmm.
extremely good runner for his size. Now he couldn't hit like maybe Lazaro Montes is being talked about, but it's almost like you're kind of trying to sell me, or not sell me, but convince me that this is a Carlos Peguero with a hit tool.
Yeah, some of our scouts have actually brought up that comparison, just the idea of, and again, it's such a dangerous thing, and we throw out comps as part of what we do, right? We've learned, anybody that's been doing this for any sort of time, you start learning that it's one thing to throw out comps so that you can kind of get a visual of the player, whether it's body wise or some of the tools. When you start
Mhm.
expecting somebody to be, whether it's Jordan Alvarez or anybody else, that's you're going down a dangerous path. But to your point, yes, a lot of our scouts, or a few of our scouts, have brought up the idea of Carlos Peguero. Just to your point, that large frame and that big human being with like surprising athleticism, and there is some of that in Lazaro Montes for sure.
Interesting. Okay, well, how about the two shortstops, the two infielders? Tell me a little bit about Arroyo and a little bit about Gonzalez, and then we'll let you go.
Yeah, so Michael Arroyo, right-handed hitting infielder out of Colombia. Um, he's been spoken of very highly and very well online, and kind of to the point, just a natural hitter, really fast hands, a compact swing, and he's been one, as has been said online. We've seen him hit in Colombia, we've seen him hit in the Dominican Republic, we've seen him hit in Mexico at like national tournaments, we've seen him hit in the Bahamas. So he's been one where we're supplementing just to offer our naked eye, like, hey, we love the swing, and that's great. But the fact that we've seen him against different levels of competition outside of Colombia kind of reinstates the fact, or reinforces the fact that we think this is a guy who's just going to go out and hit. The strength is certainly coming along; it already has. Defensively, we're going to rotate him everywhere in the infield. He for
Okay.
sure has the athleticism and the hands to play shortstop. Obviously, when you compare him to somebody, the next person that we're going to talk to, then, oh, well, he gets moved off a shortstop. And I think there's a difference between saying if he doesn't end up in shortstop, it's not because he can't do it. It's just there might be somebody who's just a better defender.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, though, we're looking at somebody wherever he ends up on the infield. Like, we really, really trust the hit grade, which is something that we don't say a lot in the scouting community and the scouting industry. And we think the power is going to come. And yeah, he's performed. He's got some sort of lineage. His brother plays minor leagues. His dad played minor leagues as well. And again, the fact that we've seen him perform, and that's not always the case. There is a level of taking some sort of risk sometimes, and you trust some of the other information over the performance, and the fact that we have the performance being balanced out or supplemented by the fact that we actually did see him perform across the board, then it gives us a level of trust that you usually don't get, especially out of players from countries outside of the Dominican and Venezuela, where
Right.
you're slamming the table on the hit grade, and yeah, we're excited about it.
And how about Martin Gonzalez? He's been on the radar for seemingly 2.5 years. Everyone's kind of been waiting for him to sign.
Yeah, Martin has been a famous name out of the Dominican Republic. So he's sort of the opposite of Michael Arroyo. Like, Michael Arroyo is like the pure hitter, and Martin Gonzalez is just a pure defender. He's like an elite defender at a premium position as shortstop. Not to say that he can't hit. For us, it's going to be really fun to see our player development kind of put their hands on Martin, because
Hmm.
he's got like the hand speed and he's got the strength. Doesn't have the pure field of hit that Michael Arroyo and Lazaro Montes have. But when you're playing shortstop at that level, and like you're that impactful of a defender, you don't really have to hit a lot. So and the fact that he checks off a lot of those boxes, and there are some elements to him that are exciting. Yeah, if he puts it together, you're looking at a everyday shortstop at least. And so you don't get to say that or find that a whole lot every year. And so the fact that we had a chance to acquire somebody like that, yeah, it was. We're very positive about it. And again, out of anybody that's going to be handled by PD, with him, I'm the most curious about, because there are some. He checks off already some of the other boxes. If our PD can get him to that next level as a hitter, then you're talking about a bigger ceiling.
Yeah, sounds like the guy in this class that there's still something to be unlocked, and that's always exciting.
Correct.
Frankie Thon Jr., thank you so much for joining the Prospects Live scouting show. Again, there's a new name for this show every week. But Frankie, really do appreciate your time, man, and you have a great day.